Hello, I'm Peter Sleskeen, Director of the Monterey Trialogue, a Middlebury University program that examines the relationship among the United States, Russia, and China by engaging experts from each country and beyond. We are very pleased to have Xiang Lanxin as our guest. Xiang Lanxin is Professor Emeritus of International History and Politics at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, the founding director of the Institute of Security Policy, China National Institute for SCO International Exchange and Judicial Cooperation in Shanghai, and a fellow at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C., as well as a regular participant in the Valdai Conference in Sochi, Russia. Lanxin is one of the very few people in the world who is equally welcome in Brussels, Beijing, Washington, D.C., and Moscow. So we're very happy to have you here with us today.
Thank you very much, Peter. Very happy to be here.
So your given name is Lanxin. Lan means blue. Why are you blue?
Well, this is related to my father's side. The origins, of course, is the Qing dynasty's founding clan, known as a bannerman class. So those days, of course, the Qing dynasty or the Manchu dynasty was organized in what they call the banners, which means different ethnic or different military groups by color. So you have yellow, blue, white, and red. So it's altogether 8 banners. Blue is one of the groups. I would say basically it means these are the people who are responsible for taking over Beijing or China in 1644. So they originated in Manchuria, they entered the Great War, they conquered Beijing. So they are the ones established the regime, from 1644 to 1911. So that means my family is there in Beijing since 1644. It's part of the military aristocracy.
And the blue banner were the Han Chinese.
Well, each banner, each color has 3 ethnic groups, actually. Manchu, Mongols, and Han. Now, Manchu and the Mongols are the original partners as a minority, the ethnic minority in China. The Han banners were assigned to defend the empire, the Ming dynasty in Manchuria. That's their job. But in the last stage of the Manchu conquest, they decide to collaborate with the Manchus. So these are the group also given that title. But you have to be verifiable. You have done that before the conquest, 1644.
So your father's ancestors had already been military.
We are the Ming generals.
So
yes.
Ming military generals stationed in the north to defend against the Manchus.
Yes.
But then as the dynasty degraded, they saw an opportunity to switch sides and then served Qing faithfully for the next 300 years.
Not that glorious if you think about it. It's very much like what French would call during the German occupation, they would call collaborateurs, right? Collaborators.
Well, glorious enough in that they did help take Beijing.
They are on the winning side, at least for,
300 years as opposed to just a couple.
Yeah. But eventually they are losing, right? In 1911. So the bannerman disintegrated.
But that was not the end of your family's military connections.
That's true. Well, as far as I can recall, my family has always been the military, right? At least Ming Dynasty, probably even earlier. But after the Republic is established in 1911, we become more or less, you can say, refugees. Because the bannermen as a class, they have a government, the subsidy for every family. But after 1911, they lost everything. So they have to look for jobs, so to speak, as everybody else. Now, why we reconnect with military? That's because the Japanese invasion In the early 30s, Japanese bombing of Shanghai, Japanese eventually invade Shanghai. My parents at the time are the patriotic young students. They're, of course, obviously influenced very much by left-wing ideology. They decide we cannot take this anymore. They joined the New Fourth Army almost at the same time, as a teenager, basically. So yes, both my parents end up a military career. Yes.
And so they began resisting the Japanese, and then carried on during the Civil War.
All the way through, even after the revolution. Yeah. But, on my mother's side, I would say even more interesting, because my mother's side, they are among the first group of Christian converts, because this is this coastal area where the Christianity, Western missionary activities are very, very strong. So my family, my mother's side, was converted by American missionaries into something I believe is called the Episcopal Church. So my grandmother, my mother grew up a devout Christian, singing in choir. It's a very, very serious Christian family, until she joined New Fourth Army or the Communist Party. She has to give up the faith, obviously. I would say until she was 95, I took her to the church for the first time. So it is quite interesting. It symbolizes the interaction between the United States and China in a way. But, with a very, interesting career and interesting family history. Yes, yes.
So your father's family was shaped by interaction between the Han and the Manchu invaders and eventual rulers, and your mother's family by the next wave of foreigners who came in.
The barbarians.
From the sea. Different
it's very different
kinds of barbarians.
Right.
And then your siblings are also all in the military. They followed their parents.
Yes, it is a customary thing here in China after 1949, when your parents in the military. Yes, usually children chose a military career. Not always, of course, but my siblings did it. I believe also had to do with the Cultural Revolution. At that time, people after high school, they can no longer go into university because the university system was destroyed entirely during the early years of Cultural Revolution. Talking about 66 to 69, for 3 years. Now, either you go to countryside, which most Chinese, high school graduates, because Mao decided to kick them into countryside. They are part of the Red Guards movement. They help Mao to overthrow the old guards, but then, after that, Mao thought them being useless and even dangerous, so most of them go to countryside. But if you have a good connection with the military, of course, you prefer not to go to countryside. You go to military, which is much better career. So, yes, we have 5 siblings. Well, I'm the youngest. All my brothers, sisters went into military, yes, in the different services.
And so you, as the youngest, eventually did have an opportunity to go to university, and then...
Well, not. That is a total surprise. You see, at that time, I was a rebel in the family. I had the opportunity to go to military, as everybody else. I was the ones decided, no, I want to see countryside. I actually volunteer to go to countryside. The government policy is if you have siblings, they're all in military or elsewhere, not in the same town with your parents. The last one is automatically you can stay in the city. They will find a, let's say, factory job or some kind of, paid salaried job for you. I was the one to reject that option, which surprised everybody, including my parents. My parents was not told when I made the decision. so my parents actually went to the high school to ask him why he has to go to countryside. School authorities say, he said we want to go. Yes, I'm the one volunteer. You can say, yeah, teenage rebellion. I was 17, but also driven by this kind of idealistic thinking, saying, I want to see countryside. I want to see how Chinese people at the bottom of the society, how they live. I want to learn things.
So where did you go?
I go to one of the poorest places in China, which has a nickname, has a reputation being so poor, it's called Little Siberia of China. The earth for growing, agricultural products is so poor for historical reason, because these are the sediments of the Yellow River. When the Yellow River changed, since Tang Dynasty, changed direction, they left a lot of alkaline and the salty earth. You cannot grow wheat, very, very difficult. Cannot grow cotton. So people live on potatoes, basically. You say, very, very poor. I was actually excited. I want to see how dirt poor people are, but even so, I'm psychologically fully prepared. I'm willing to fight. I'm still shocked. Because even drinking water, I cannot believe it. Drinking water tastes salty. And we don't have rice. We're from south of China. We're a rice country. We don't have rice. And we don't have cooking oil. It's much, much harder than I thought. But I'm still in good spirit.
Well, what about the people? You wanted to see the people from the bottom of society. What did you discover?
Well, the people there, the ordinary people, the farmers, the main problem is they don't have any chance to get cash, the money. But remember, at that time, the system is called People's Commune System. We work together collectively. Every day we start 5 maybe in the morning, end at 7 in the evening, about 13 hours a day at least. I think they are not starving, but they cannot have a high quality food and hardly any vegetable. I couldn't believe how long I have to deal with turnips. Government actually give us a little subsidy, some cash, but they have nothing. They have nothing. But I was quite impressed by the particular village I'm in, because the peasants there, my particular unit there, they refuse to, surrender to nature. They fight the alkaline and the salty earth with enormous courage. By the time I arrived in that village, already become a model village in the sense they really fight the way using physical labor to do it. Of course, we participate in that campaign immediately. The idea is to get the dirt with sour, with, what do you call these?
Acid.
Yeah, acid, yes. With those particular earth, talk about, miles away, carried by, with a cart or carry, we all do that, to bring those earth back to our earth, then to mix them together. Mm-hmm. Inch by inch is quite amazing hard work.
Because alkaline is basic and you need acid to even it out.
Yes.
So by hand, you're mixing different kinds of earth.
You're basically using your hard labor to forcefully, change the nature of the character of the earth. But that's a really inch by inch work.
Well, that is the Chinese way for thousands of years.
It is.
Human force.
I was impressed by the farmers' determination not to, surrender to the nature. So, as I said, when we arrived, these conditions already began to improve because they have, better earth conditions. I spent a whole 4 years there. After 2 years, we can see they can even grow wheat and other stuff. So it's quite an experience. Yes, I'm very impressed by the farmers. Yes.
So after 4 years fighting the land alongside the farmers, you returned to the city and went to Fudan?
Well, that's a totally surprise. Nobody even know. Deng Xiaoping came back. We all happy saying, we know Deng Xiaoping want to make economy better. But the biggest surprise is the first thing he did is to announce, this is 1977, I believe it's fall of 1977, suddenly government announced we're going to restore universities. Now, university, how they recruit university students? National exams, which has been there forever. Every Asian country has that system. They say everybody can try. We all excited, but as you know, when you spend so many years on land, working, how can you manage to remember the mathematics? Because there's so many subjects you have to deal with. And government are not giving us free time, saying you can stop, start to review what you have learned in high school. So yes, the majority couldn't, even though given, they were given opportunity, they failed in the end. But it's quite an equal opportunity. It's amazing thing at that point. Because remember, the people who went to the countryside, the several group of people, you have people 10 years older than me because they were there earlier, right? Then you have people a little bit younger than me. I'm actually in the younger group. I was 21 at the time. So we all try. We all do whatever we can. But fortunately, I don't want to brag, of course. I was a top student in senior high school. For some reason, I managed to pick up mathematics and the English and, well, the other subjects, I don't have a problem. I always loved, politics, Chinese literature, because I read all these, geography, history. I don't have a problem. The key problem is English and the mathematics. But I managed to pick up my mathematics within 2 months, actually. So when the exam day come, Chinese actually made a movie about that. It's simply called 1977 because every young people is so excited. But I didn't realize I performed quite good because Fudan is one of the top university. I didn't realize I end up getting into Fudan, yes, and also a top program, international relations. But just give you a profile, we all together, we city slickers, we work together as a group, altogether 52 people. Only 2 managed to pass that exam.
So that wasn't the last time you were part of a trailblazing minority. So you were the first crop after the Cultural Revolution to go to university in China.
Right.
And then you were the first crop to be sent abroad for further education.
Yes. Well, that is also, you see, we are the pioneer in that sense, yes. As a senior in college, and the government suddenly, without any indication, the government decide we're going to send students study abroad. Again, they set up the system for national exam system just for entrance. I believe the whole country at that point, they give less than 2,000 scholarship for the first group, but the majority are, science, technology, because that's what the Chinese need, desperately. Only a small fraction of them are human, social sciences, and so on and so forth. So I was lucky to be one of those chosen. Well, I did well with the exam and chosen eventually to go to the United States for studying international relations.
And you were at Johns Hopkins.
I believe I look at other universities, Stanford, I look at the JFK, maybe Princeton as well. I feel, at that point, my feeling is I don't want to do theory. IR theory, that kind of in fashion in those days. But I want to, to study the real stuff. So then I discovered Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. They are very practical. They're also the top-notch scholars. So it's fit my interests perfectly.
And you studied European politics and history.
Yes, but that's quite a struggle. Yes. Because we're the first group. When we arrived, the Science administration automatically assume I will study China. So they threw all my file into China studies. Then I discovered a week later, I protested. I say, I was young, yes, maybe a little bit abrasive without being considerate. I basically saying, why should I fly 10,000 miles or so to come to a foreign country to study China with a foreign scholar, right? I say, which makes the China program director, who is a well-known China expert, at the time, make him really, really unhappy. Because that's why. But then the administration say, what do you want to study? I said, I want to study transatlantic relations. I want to study Europe. I look at the profile of the faculty. I found the director of European Studies, Professor David Kaleo. I read a couple of chapters of his new book at that time. I immediately said, well, this is somebody I want to study with. He's European expert, but also the expert on transatlantic relations, NATO, and so on. So this is how I end up. But still, the administration reject me, even then. They basically threatened me saying, for European study master degree, you need 2 foreign languages. Chinese are not included. So English, of course, is not, meaning 2 European languages. So I said, can I try? Then say, okay. They say, it's your responsibility. You're on government scholarship, right? If you fail, don't blame us. You have to talk to your own government. Well, I was determined, so I end up actually with 3 foreign languages, European languages. So, yes, I did study extremely hard in those days, but I like languages.
Well, so then after a quick stint as a young professor in South Carolina, you ended up in Geneva, Switzerland, where you could put all of those languages to use.
That is also accidental development. Right. Yes, you're right. My first job is in Clemson University, yes, as assistant professor. I like Clemson, but it's a little bit too narrow a kind of cultural environment for me. Sorry to say. American South, it's I can feel, they are, all these Christian evangelists, which I cannot. Even though I came from Christian family, I cannot deal with those Bob Jones and so on type. So when I have a chance to go to Geneva, of course, I take it. I'm very happy, ever since. So, yes, you're right. Yes, my language actually helps. You're right.
Yeah, from an all-English environment in South Carolina to a multilingual country in the heart of Europe. So after been a long career in Geneva, many great books, constant connection with the policy world. So let's turn to policy questions now. You've written quite a bit about Western misunderstandings of China, which go back a long way. The Jesuits, you think, made an honest effort and actually got quite a long way to understanding the Chinese. But almost all of the barbarians who arrived thereafter have fallen short of the Jesuit standard.
Well, yes, I tend to believe the Jesuits are the only barbarians who actually made a serious effort to understand China, or Chinese culture. They came to China, the Ming Dynasty, they immediately plunged themselves into language, culture studies. But that's a typical Jesuits, philosophy. But another important thing about Jesuits is they are accommodationists. That is, philosophically, I think, is extremely important. They are not dogmatic. You never see Jesuits being dogmatic, messianic, exclusive, saying, either black or white, good versus evil. That's what the Jesuits reject. But then, Christianity, especially after European Enlightenment, I would say Jesuits are the Renaissance man. But after Enlightenment for me is a counter-revolution against Renaissance, in a sense. Then you have a different kind of attitude towards other culture beyond the Christian world. Well, you have the most dreadful type, which I spent a lot of pages criticizing, for example, Count Montesquieu type. Power can be divided actually into three sectors and so on and so forth. That kind of. Then, of course, Montesquieu never been to China. He spent so much, in his book, The Spirit of Law, attacking China, basically using China as a counterpoint. So this is, of course, become orthodoxy today. If your system is not democracy or is not following Western value, has no legitimacy, you should not exist. This is where the framework of policy making in the West, particularly, I would say, in the United States, under Biden administration in particular, less so than the Trump administration. So I would say conflict between China and the US is almost inevitable if they insist on that approach.
But that approach, you're saying that since the Enlightenment, essentially,
right,
China has occupied a special place in the Western imagination,
right,
as the sort of centralized despotic state par excellence.
Well, that's true. But since China, after Opium War, you see this Chinese economy and the Chinese state is declining so dramatically. Let's say, before Opium War, we talk about 1830s, which most Western scholars prefer to ignore the fact that China is still a leading economy. Okay, the only study that prove it is OECD, of course, grand historian Angus Maddison, who traced that economic history, called the Chinese economy in the millennia or something. No, he discovered, Chinese economy occupies 32.5% of global GDP before the Opium War. But when you think about after the Opium War, when communists took over in 1949, it's less than 2% of global GDP. That's almost like a free fall.
What is it now?
Now it's about less than 20. So you see, for the West, I'm tired with these outcries saying Chinese taking over everybody. The rise of China threatened everybody. From a Chinese point of view, well, there is no rise of China, right? This is just a return to prior super economic stardom. It's a restoration. You see, Chinese prefer to use that word. Xi Jinping himself used that word, restoration. But that is a message nobody would accept. See, they say...
Although in the Chinese narrative, it seems like restoration would imply sort of a focus on the prior era of economic superstardom and a return to that rightful place, with the century in between being an anomaly. But the century of humiliation is a strong focus in the Chinese narrative.
Well, but remember, the return to previous glory means what? Today, it is interpreted as a global ambition of conquest, even displays a superpower like the United States. But Chinese historic status would be a regional, relatively, there is no question it's being regional. You can say hegemon, a regional leading power, but never beyond. There is no proof for projecting its power beyond the Chinese cultural sphere. In the West, it's called colonialism, which means you project your power overseas, which is far away from your own homeland. You've never seen that in Chinese history. Then you are making the argument that Chinese want to conquer the world, behave like a European, colonial power in European history. In my view, it's historically inaccurate and also just a political argument, has no historic evidence that Chinese will conquer the world. Paul Kennedy made that point so clearly when he wrote his Rise and Fall, Great Powers. The chapter 1 is Mean China. We had the world #1 navy at the time, 1250. Now, Paul Kennedy said, what if Chinese began to think about conquering the world? Who is going to discover America or even Australia? You don't have all these Columbus, Vasco da Gama nonsense. The Chinese will take over everything at that point. No, Paul Kennedy said, we'll change the course of history.
Well, wait, let's dwell on that for a second, because I was going to bring up that same moment.
Oh, go ahead.
So this is the classic example that China, to use sort of the modern terminology, had the capability to dominate the global order during the Ming Dynasty. It had this extraordinary navy and then pulled back voluntarily. It didn't have the mindset to go discover all these new worlds and colonize them. Now, of course, China once again has one of the world's largest navies. It makes sense in modern conditions and faced with American presence in the Pacific. Chinese trade, obviously, is extraordinarily important. Chinese ships take goods across all the world's oceans. So what was true before of a giant land power that briefly experimented with naval power and then retreated is no longer true. So perhaps the mentality is the same, but the material conditions have shifted. China is now an enormous naval power.
Yes, but it's not really prevailing, far from being a leading navy power. No, far from being that. You also have to understand that if you want to have a global reach with your navy power, you have to have this mentality, or you have to become Mahan, a strategist, which I doubt Chinese have reached that point. I doubt it will ever reach that point, because if you want to control most of the ocean routes, that's what, if you want to become a hegemon, the maritime hegemon, you have to take a lot of responsibilities. United States is the one, they can say, well, U.S. Navy people, they told me many times, we can choke off any points, any, critical points on the ocean within 24 hours. And well, that's why Americans are doing these things. They have to build so many bases all over the world, spend so much, money doing this, and you have to take all the responsibility in the policeman of the world. Now, do China have the intention of being policeman in the world? Because you have to take the responsibility. I see zero intention on that. It does not mean they are not worried about their protection of the trade rules and as a leading trading nation. Of course. But on the other hand, that also means it's always a better idea to have a peaceful relationship with other great powers instead of have an arms race, even in the Navy area. But it looks like the United States, at least from Chinese point of view, with its new containment strategy, the last 10 years, I would say, since Obama, they called Pivot to Asia, which is essentially it's a new containment strategy. Yes, the Chinese was sufficiently stimulated that we have to have a serious Navy. Most people don't remember that. Let's say 15 years ago, when people tried to define Chinese Navy, they call, is this a blue Navy? No. It is a yellow Navy? No. The yellow Navy means coastal, The maximum they can define is called the brown Navy. So in between blue and the yellow. Now, yes, Chinese is building a blue Navy, but they were driven, in my view, more by the geopolitical reality, which Americans seem to be establishing, that kind of containment system. So they were more, at least at the beginning, it's more passive. For example, we never had a Coast Guard until a few years ago, you see. We never even had the concept of Coast Guard. So if you tell me Chinese are too ambitious to take over everybody's, come on, that's exaggeration. I don't see it.
So what explains the deterioration in U.S.-Chinese relations over the last 10 years? Is it purely a function of China's rise in the United States, worry about its position, or is there something
relative
else?
Decline of the West? Relative, I emphasize. Relative decline of the West is one important thing, particularly the United States, which is obvious. Paul Kennedy said that a long time ago. But there is another important reason is that the economic competition, which, remember, the Chinese economic development lasted for 4 decades, more or less followed principles which are not historically, typically Chinese way of doing things. Okay? Because Chinese economic thinking, I'm talking about throughout history, internal circulation, meaning supply demand for the domestic economy is the key. They never believe the foreign trade is that important. Chinese created the first international trading network, actually, 2,000 years ago. But Silk Road never played an important role to help the emperor to build the legitimacy of his rule or even stabilize the domestic economy. It's a marginal factor for Chinese economic development. Now, 4 decades ago, China's opened up to the world. They found themselves in the cutthroat kind of internet trading competition. So they use their historic spirit and assets, but they combine with imported, you can say, predatory thinking, which was starting with the British Industrial Revolution, at least, right? You have to beat everybody, or you want to mass production, make yourself a factory of the world. So we have a comparative advantage, obviously. Cheap labor, and the pure number of the labor, plus the quality of the labor. Okay. So all these put together, we enjoy enormous comparative advantage, which began to gradually undermine the edge of Western economy. So Western country, for quite a while, they're content with that because they enjoy the benefits of cheap products from China. Then they can only make money from other areas. We're talking about Wall Street and the Silicon Valley, even make more money there. But the problem is the majority of Americans are not necessarily benefit from Wall Street and the Silicon Valley. This is where you see the rebellion of the middle class. And this is, by the way, internal US crisis externalized into foreign policy, particularly under Donald Trump. And Donald Trump's message is loud and clear.
It seems like the concern with China comes from two quarters in the U.S. On one hand, there's Trump's electorate that blames China and globalization for the loss of their jobs and security.
Right.
On the other hand, there are the liberal internationalists, a very different crowd, who see China as a threat to the liberal order. So these are our politically opposing factions in the U.S. who, for different reasons, converge on China as the principal problem.
You're absolutely right. This is why they called bipartisan consensus.
But do you think that will last?
I have doubts, but it's
superficially they both focus on China, but for such different reasons that in policy terms, maybe they will disagree to such an extent that the thing will unravel.
Yes, but you're right. I mean, liberal side, and including trade union and right-wing extreme, makes suddenly found a consensus, saying the leading problem is China. Okay. Everything's wrong is because China. Now that logic cannot last very long because it's simply not sustainable argument. Besides, it also reflects weakness of American system. If the only bipartisan consensus is to get tough with China, that means American system is in deep, deep trouble, or American democracy in deep trouble, because this is the only handle both parties can hang on saying we still have a bipartisan agreement. And the reasons China not only exaggerates China's role, that's a reality, but also means they don't have any other handle to hang on. The American voters disagree profoundly with each other on almost everything else. There is no bipartisan consensus. By American Montesquieu system is more or less collapsing, especially since January 6th, right? I mean, you can see Montesquieu model, which is American model, is a pure version of Montesquieu. It's collapsing. So I hope the rational political elite eventually will realize focusing on China or blame China for everything. You certainly can blame China for a lot of economic practices, but not everything, right? It's not going to work. It's not going to save American system.
Let's bring Russia into the picture. So you say Americans blame China for everything, but they don't only blame China. Russia is obviously considered a big problem, a big threat to the liberal order. The national security strategy gives separate sections to each of these two countries. And although there is much discussion of a possible confrontation in Taiwan. So far, thank God it hasn't happened. But the US and Russia are in more or less direct conflict in Ukraine. So how do you see Russia entering this picture?
Well, U.S.-Russian relationship or Western-Russian relationship is, I would say, it's more a psychological problem. It's more a tragedy within one culture, one civilization. That's, of course, as a Chinese, I can say that.
So China is perceived as an alien, separate culture, whereas Russia is part of the West.
Yes, you had a problem, the Cold War, and so on and so forth. But historically, Russia has been part of the West, part of the Christian world. However you want to exclude Russia because it's Orthodox Church or other Euro-Asian, position, you cannot deny Russia being part of your civilization. This is very different from U.S.-China relations.
Sorry, but just to go back to that point, Russia, elite Russians were all speaking French, maybe even better than Russian, and then Napoleon invaded.
Yes.
They all loved Goethe and Schiller, and then Hitler invaded. So you can be part of the same culture while geopolitically being at odds for a number of centuries. So those two, the push and pull was there from the beginning.
But even with Hitler's invasion, it's still part of the European power game within one cultural sphere. We all know the roots of the so-called Deutschfrage, the German problem. Hitler was driven by German problem.
No, Hitler had a very different conception of Western civilization. He treated the French and the Slavs quite differently because he assumed they were different categories.
Well, that's true. But remember, Hitler also considered Japanese differently from, but that actually is not, to me, it's not the big issue. I don't think even Hitler is launching a racial war against Russia. That's not the reality. The reality is the geopolitics. He has to take over in order to build his empire. Then Napoleon, of course, conqueror of Russia, it's the same, basically. Now, from Chinese point of view, you have to understand, this is almost like, I use the word ecumenical peace concept, which is you should be able to reach a peaceful relation between Russia and the rest of the Western Christian world, especially after Russians admitted they were failing during the Cold War, and they are saying we want to join the whole great European home,
from Lisbon to Vladivostok.
Yes, and so on and so forth. For me, it's a great opportunity of achieving ecumenical peace within the Christian world, but that was failed. Not so much by Russia, but it's by the West. That, I think, is my view. I do believe it's the Chinese leaders' sense about this. We talk about why Chinese refuse to declare the Ukraine war an invasion, even today, because NATO enlargement is something that nobody should be oblivious, saying this means nothing. It's nothing to do with the Russian behavior. That's absurd. Remember, the other part, again, as a Chinese watching the internecine war in Colosseum, let's say, between, you guys are fighting. If we're watching this, we are rather puzzled by the fact that Russians, they are talking about, balanced power, and the West, United States, they all talk about the language of Westphalian language. Balanced power, maintain equilibrium, blah, blah, blah.
Sovereignty.
So everybody talking, this is your talk. Chinese don't even know this concept until British force us to. But then somehow the Russian talk, the same thing, is considered arbitration, deviated view, unorthodox, but the American or the Europeans talk about it is considered morally correct. Whatever Russian says, we also need maintain our sense of national security. If you push too far to our frontier and so on, I thought Putin tried his best, no matter what, as an outsider of the European civilization. I look at it, Putin tried. You cannot say Putin did not try. And I very much doubt to say Putin wants to conquer entire Europe or take back every piece of Soviet empire. I really don't see make any sense. But it is hubris. It is the arrogance on the part of the West, particularly the United States, to launch that dangerous move of NATO enlargement. It is the trigger of the whole thing. Then you can say it's a serious event. We have to look at that conflict from that perspective. Having said that, I don't defend Putin. I'm one of the few Chinese actually use that word in public, aggression against Ukraine. I actually use that expression. It is clearly aggression, certainly violating UN Charter. There is no question about that. But the roots of the problem, nobody should ignore. So this is why Chinese, not just elite, but including scholars like myself, I have certain sense, grudging sympathy, you can say, with Putin's position there. He was pushed into a very awkward situation.
So Russia, in some sense, has been part of the West, part of the Christian world, although a slightly different kind of Christian world, heir to Constantinople as opposed to Rome.
Also, ethnically, they are the Caucasians, don't forget.
Well, Caucasians is a funny euphemism to use in regard to Russians, because there's real Caucasians in Russia, and then in Russia, and then there are
but they are, yes.
white Northern Europeans.
Okay.
Because the Russians call the Caucasians black. I mean, Russia could be part of the West or of Christendom, I suppose, although there was certainly a divide in Europe and many wars to prove that they don't quite belong. But Russia has never been part of the free world of the liberal order. So insofar as the U.S. order is not confined to the West, there doesn't seem to have been much of an opportunity for Russia to integrate itself within that structure. And Putin certainly tried, was very happy to get into the WTO and so forth. But now, whatever the possibilities of that might have been, the rupture is clear. There is the liberal order on one side, and Russia very definitely on the other side of a bright red line. Where that line will be drawn, we will find out. But so you say that from the Chinese perspective, this looks like an intra-West conflict, and you can observe from the sidelines a bit bemused. But now Russia and China have been lumped together by the US and its allies, and Russia itself has declared itself a civilization state, which is clearly an attempt to put itself on the same level as China and India. Is this new partnership between Russia and China entirely contingent? Is it entirely a function of American pressure? Or do you think there is a long-term strategic alignment that might even produce a sort of civilizational rapprochement?
Well, it started as a marriage of convenience, no doubt, because there is no real love between Russians and Chinese. Historically, at least since Catherine the Great, there is nothing that you can call it a friendship between Chinese and the Russians. We even have a particular name for Russians, Old Hairy Man, compared with our universal name for all the Europeans. It's called barbarians. We think the Russians are even inferior to the barbarians. But yes, we were driven together by the US containment strategy in general, because the US, think about this, post-Cold War US policy gradually turned into a new containment strategy against Russia, no matter what you interpret the purpose of NATO enlargement. And then, of course, since 2010, under Obama, the so-called pivot to Asia, they also established another containment strategy in the Asian Pacific. Recently, of course, even more so, they called Indo-Pacific. So they are building a real containment line around China. So this is only natural. The two countries were driven together for geopolitical reasons. But on the other hand, I would say marriage of convenience of this nature usually not last long if there's something changes systematically, with the international order. But it looks like it's not going to change very much. This is something I do not understand. The American approach is, for the first time, Americans policy makers decide to alienate Russia and China at the same time, which is against, of course, the Kissingerian or Kissinger's view. Even Donald Trump Donald Trump is more Kissingerian in that sense, saying that's a stupid, no matter what, tactically, it's a bad thing to do. But it looks like it's very well established. They're willing to fight two fronts, basically. So obviously, the marriage of convenience turned into some kind of love story now. But that love story, not just sustained by economic, but by the geopolitical concerns. The economic side, we all know that the Russian pivot to east, which is not because of the Ukraine war, because Putin already started 2018. I recall I was there, the East Economic Forum at Vladivostok, 2018. That's the only one Xi Jinping also attended with Putin. I remember listening to, at that time, the statistic for, I think, 2018 data shows that the Russian trade already, majority of trade with the East rather than with Europe. So economic relationship, of course, is strengthened further by the war in Ukraine and so on. So you have a multiple dimension of that relationship to keep that marriage going. So yes, I have no doubt the relationship is going to be quite solid. Will Russia change again? Historically, if the West, Europe in particular, extend an olive branch or some reason, Russians' priority is to crawling back to the West, right? The so-called Euro-Asian complex. The Euro side is always a guest priority. So we don't know. But it looks like it's not going to happen on the Western side. Next 10 or 15 years, I don't see it. So yes, the relationship is quite well established between Russia and China.
And what if the West offers an olive branch to China in order to further constrain Russia? The Chinese won't believe that it is authentically offered?
Really, what Chinese need is to resolve the Taiwan problem. Okay, if you reduce the tariffs, which is nice, but that's not convincing enough for China to abandon that solid relationship with Russia. If they really change their attitude towards Taiwan, that means removing the only potential cause for a war between the United States and China. Taiwan is the only potential reason for that. Then China probably have to think about, the value of a solid, close relationship with Russia. But I don't see American administration will do anything. What they do now is called the salami slicing approach, pushing for Taiwan independence. It's obvious, very obvious. Yeah.
How far do you think that can go before?
We don't know. Well, I would say they are at this moment, the direction or the trend is moving towards Plan B of Taiwan independence. Taiwan independence movement had Plan A, which is straightforward declaration of independence. That's something, Pompeo and U.S. Congress, anti-China people, that's what they advocate. But that means war, right, immediately. So they probably wouldn't do that. They would not follow Pompeo kind of suggestion. So Plan B is de facto, basically. Well, they called one China, one Taiwan. Or the Taiwan leadership called, the pro-independence leadership called country-to-country relations.
How would that be different from the current situation, where it already is de facto, more or less?
They obscure the concept of de jure sovereignty here. See, that's what's called one China, one Taiwan. Basically saying Taiwan does not really belong to China. But we are not claim, that's a Plan B, supposed to be, we don't claim de jure sovereignty right away. But it is obviously it's a transition model, which this is what the U.S. are pushing for. Okay, and not just U.S. but also rally Western, Democratic alliance, even NATO get into that, jump into that thing. I think it's very, very dangerous for Europeans to jump into something they don't understand very well. Because this is a war and a peace situation. China cannot accept Plan B. If Plan B become obvious, clear, or declared, that also means war. See? So this is where I think I personally do not see there is any chance the Washington will change the course. Taiwan is the thing is going to lead to military confrontation. I will say at this stage, as I see it, sooner rather than later. Now, how long? A year or two? I wouldn't want to make a clear prediction here. My sense is we are close to a real confrontation.
And you think it's likelier than not?
I will say, yeah.
Of an actual direct clash between China and the U.S.?
Yes. In some form. I wouldn't say necessarily a declaration of war between U.S. and China. I would say some kind of, including possibility of accidental clash militarily over Taiwan, which will, under the current circumstances, will escalate. It's very difficult to control once you have this, because of this atmosphere in both countries, political, domestic atmosphere. So it is dangerous, yes. Very, very risky. You look at the recent, just finished the exercise. You look at the PRA exercise, that's a real war game here. It's not even an exercise per se. Very clear what the PRA is going to do.
Well, what would you tell American policymakers, or what do you tell them that is actually politically possible in the current situation that would avoid such an outcome?
I would tell them, first of all, you have to realize that there is a real danger there. Don't discount that danger by believing, which is many policymakers, including congressional leaders, the logic Americans, including the top China policymaker like Kurt Campbell, what they believe is deterrence. They think that if we deploy troops, we rally the Democratic Alliance around, China will be sufficiently deterred. So we're not worried. As long as the deterrence works, sufficient, China dare not do it. Even if we push further, the salami slicing. That approach failed to understand. This is what I will explain to them in Washington. I tried to explain to them even in Washington. That is to say, don't underestimate Chinese leaders' determination of taking military action, because that issue is so domestically explosive. If the United States push further, the Chinese don't take action politically for any leadership, Xi Jinping or not. That's almost like a suicidal. In a sense, you're losing prestige. Popular feeling is that Xi Jinping is chicken, basically. Last year, Chinese bloggers spent a whole night without sleep watching Nancy Pelosi's, flight. Majorities at that point
hoping for something exciting.
Oh yeah, or at least shoot them maybe, or do something. But nothing happens. Total disappointment. No. Politically, the Taiwan issue, if you don't react, if American push too far, there is no deterrence is going to stop. You see what I mean? Because from military point of view, this is the PRA calculation or Chinese high command. It is not a real problem for Chinese to launch a very quick operation against Taiwan. Americans, they couldn't really come to the rescue, no matter how they built what they call the integrated deterrence system. Too far away, the closest would be Okinawa, and then you have other places. And the allies are totally unreliable. Can you imagine Japanese will automatically get into war with China? Japan will not commit suicide doing this because on behalf of Taiwan. Australia, come on, British. These alliances has no deterrence value from a Chinese point of view. And then the hardcore military conditions, including logistics, distances, and the technology, everything. Yes, PRA can do it. We have overwhelming power. Now, whether it's successful, they can do it in 3 days, 4 days, or maybe made some mistake. That's another issue. Actual military operation, how it goes. I doubt you will see the same situations. Putin's military planning about Ukraine. It's rather
why not? Because
shameful. Yes.
Well, the same things that make it difficult for the U.S. to come to Taiwan's aid, the fact that it's an island, make it difficult to successfully invade. To cut it off, I guess, is easy, but to take it over might not be.
Well, you see, first of all, the Chinese military knows Taiwan defense system inside and out. I put very simple way.
Well, the Russians knew the Ukrainian systems. They were all Soviet for the most part.
No, but their organizational skill is really, even logistics they couldn't provide. Chinese have no logistic problem across Taiwan Strait. Come on, I mean, right? We don't have a logistic problem. Well, my imagination would be the first hour would be knock out all the defense structure there around. Then they block each port. Then, amphibious landing. Unless Americans directly engage. Unless. But I don't believe Americans will directly engage. Meaning fighting with Chinese amphibious landing means you have to have sufficient troops on the island to do it. Or you directly hit the Chinese, let's say, Navy or Air Force or something, without provocation. You see, the point is this: we are not going to attack Okinawa first, as American military used to believe. It's called D2A2. Remember, that's the American strategy. They would thought when Chinese strategy is before they launch attack on Taiwan, they will knock out American bases. No, not necessarily. We will not. That's my view. Why should we provide casus belli? Direct, like a Pearl Harbor kind of action against Okinawa? No, it doesn't make sense. We just only focus on Taiwan. Straightforward. Even by international law, we can do it. And extremely popular with the population. Fighting spirit, I'm sure, is high. So, we don't have a logistic problem. So when you think in that direction, the blindly believing in American belief in deterrence alone, it's not going to work. They will be surprised.
Has deterrence diminished as a result of Western sanctions on Russia? Because one of the disastrous outcomes, it seems, of a war in Taiwan is the ruin of the global economy. But
right.
Perhaps China now has had time to look at how sanctions work, to create alternative payment systems with Russia. Sure. And they think that, okay, this will be a huge hit, but that with Russia, Africa, and so on, the Middle East, they went in a huge domestic market, they can survive economically no matter what financial weapons are used.
Yes. I think, yes, that's for sure. I mean, the Chinese study the Russian methods of dealing with, unprecedented sanctions. They learned a lot, but the Russian model cannot be, of course, easily copied because the Russians have only, you can say, a one-dimensional economy. Right? Yeah. They sell something everybody needs, everybody wants, and they have insatiable demand in the world market. Now, that's a different situation, but I would not say the threat of sanction actually sufficient enough to be a serious deterrence on Chinese determination of dealing with Taiwan.
And just the natural crisis in the global economy that would occur the day that the war began, that all the stock markets would collapse.
Because the Chinese believe the economy between China and the West, including the United States, is still very much intertwined. Sanction against China because of Taiwan, let's say, as severe as what they did with Russia, kicking China out of SWIFT and so on, whatever, it will hurt Western economy probably even worse in some sense. German economy will probably collapse in a certain way, and American economy certainly will into a lot of crisis. So I doubt, they will do the same thing as they did with Russia. Besides, as you already mentioned, the Belt and Road Network, which actually provide a plan B, at least, for our manufacturing goods, Latin America and so on, suppose. Unless the West decide to blockade the entire world sea lanes, declare war on China. Now, unless that happens, that's a different story. But I just don't see it. I don't see Taiwan actually is worth that much energy and efforts, despite all the rhetoric including Stoltenberg, NATO people. This nonsense they said about Taiwan makes no sense. I think Chinese actually can't afford to ignore what the statement they are making, because they cannot really do anything, the NATO countries. So it doesn't really mean very much. So deterrence, it will not work, in other words, no matter what. Deterrence itself is not working.
Well, so then final question.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't China invade just with 100% certainty in the next few years? If the situation is as you described... But let me ask the question. So the way you described it, it seems like an invasion is very likely to succeed. It can be done without hitting American targets.
Right.
So it can be sold as a legal domestic police action. The economy probably will not collapse. Deterrence isn't effective, and so forth. Right. The alternative to this brutal resolution to the long-standing Chinese problem of Taiwan is greater or lesser salami slicing. Taiwan has existed separately for a long time now. It seems like the trends basically are bad for the mainland. So the status quo seems to be allow inertia to take Taiwan in a different direction, even if the U.S. restrains itself slightly from Biden's more flamboyant positions. So why wouldn't it just be a done deal that China invades if the situation is as you described?
What kind of done deal you mean here? You mean what the done deal?
Well, it's sort of like the Ukraine problem for Russia. That
Right.
At some point, it seems like Putin understood that if Ukraine continued on its current trajectory, there would be no Russian influence there remaining at all within a few years. And the situation, I mean, Ukraine would be a bastion of sort of anti-Russian forces. It didn't work out for him, his solution, but nonetheless. And it seems like in Beijing, they could assume that time is not on their side, that absent a radical move now, Taiwan will effectively become more and more separate and independent, almost regardless of what Washington does. That is the current trajectory in inertia.
Yes. In a sense, yes. It does. Taiwan question has acquired a sense of urgency now in Beijing. Remember, the original thinking has always been maintain status quo. De facto separation of the two political entity is not a problem for Beijing. I'm talking de facto, not legal, They do their thing, they self-rule, they do their things. Even more than the Hong Kong model, because Hong Kong model is that the British Army the Royal Garrison has to be pulled out. Mainland never asked for sending PLA for a future, let's say, unification. They were even able to maintain their own military. The problem is not status quo. It is the intention. It looks increasingly clear on the American side. They want to push this legally as a permanent, separation of two Chinese entities that give the mainland no hope. The status quo eventually will turn into some form of peaceful unification. See, remember Chinese, even during Mao time, that's the standard policy there. We don't worry about Taiwan that much. Okay? It's still Chinese territory. Chiang Kai-shek running Taiwan, fine. Chiang Kai-shek will never call Taiwan independence. Because, that's what the joke is. Where's Chiang Kai-shek when we need him today, right? Because Chiang Kai-shek will say, I also own mainland.
Yeah.
That's perfect. If you have a leader who said that, that's great. Then we're not worried, you see.
Yeah, Taiwan would be a separate country a long time ago if Chiang Kai-shek hadn't wanted to come back to the mainland.
You see, that's the irony here. American politicians, they only try to do this, serve their geostrategic interests. The idea in Washington today is we will maintain Taiwan independence no matter what it takes. We have to do it. And they say it. You see?
But if they were more careful in their formulations, if there was no threat to the formal status of Taiwan as legally a part of China, then Beijing would be happy to wait 50 years, 100 years, if necessary.
Mao used to say 100 years is fine. I mean, it's not a problem. But you see, This is the stupidity I'm thinking of American policy is. Even Kissinger at the time, the friend of China, never gave in to Chinese during the first negotiations of the Shanghai Communique to recognize the PRC as the owner of Taiwan, right? But we don't have a problem with that Shanghai Communique, even though interpretation, you can always have two different interpretations. We think automatically Taiwan should be part of China, but we don't have to use force. We don't have to do anything else as long as we have a prospect that Taiwan will not drift away one day, had legal support by international community or the West saying we declare independence. That prospect should not be there. What Biden administration or what Americans are doing these days is give every indication this is what they're going to do. You see, this is why Biden's 4-time tongue slip is so damaging here. It's publicly commit U.S. saying if China do something in Taiwan, I'm going to commit to defend Taiwan. See, this is the point that I'm talking about. This is what's called strategic ambiguity. Strategic ambiguity provides the best deterrence. That's my view. Meaning, I will not tell you what I'm going to do, but I'm not going to push to encourage the Taiwanese to have a de facto or even de jure independence. At least you have to convince Beijing this is not your intention. Then Beijing will be at ease to accept status quo. That's called ambiguity. Then you say, it's called strategic clarity. Now, saying, if China do something, I will defend Taiwan. So there is no ambiguity. See? This is a very, very stupid. This is the reason I believe we are closer, much closer with a military confrontation, because they removed the only mechanism that sustained this psychological game about Taiwan.
Well, let's hope we can keep playing the game for a bit longer and that both sides
I hope so.
show some patience.
Yes. You don't have Anthony Blinken congratulate Taiwan leaders' inauguration. Think about this. This is amazing also. Then what's next from a Chinese point of view? Maybe Blinken will want to visit Taiwan, maybe at some point. Call him President of Taiwan. Okay. At least he doesn't call President Republic of China. That will be too provocative, but he still call title, congratulate him, so on and so forth. So every step American is taking, indicating the Chinese they are moving in the direction of de facto Taiwan independence. This is where the problem is.
So then the very last question. Do you think that the Chinese just have not been able to convey clearly the cost of making these sorts of statements? Or that the Washington policymakers understand very clearly that they are bringing themselves closer to a confrontation, and many of them don't mind or even might prefer a clash?
Well, the problem is it's impossible to convey clear message with each other now, with the current adversarial atmosphere. In the old days, when, they have a common enemy, which is the Soviet Union and so on and so forth, they overlook these differences. Remember, the key difference here is Americans prefer call it one China policy. Chinese call one China principle. Policy and principle, if you check dictionary, as I did, totally different concept, right?
Policies can change and principles don't,
yes,
as a rule.
And also policy usually serve a particular self-interest purpose, right? Principle means you have a moral dimension there. This is something, everybody agree. Let's say UN Charter, that's a principle, right? Americans refuse to accept the Chinese concept that one China should be a principle. So they are talking today with a very bad relationship that becomes so tense, they are basically talking past each other. Neither side is convinced the other side is talking. You see, Biden maybe mentioned so many times saying, we stay with one China policy. Now, in the old days, Chinese are happy, even though you say you stay with one China. Because with good intention, we thought that's okay. Today, of course, it's totally different. We know what you are doing is against one China principle. So your one China policy means nothing to us. So this is the charade they're playing for great power relations. If I'm reading from history, when the two major powers start to play a word game, a charade, that's a prelude to a military confrontation. Usually that's the case, because neither side accepts the other side's interpretation of almost like the same concept, but they has zero in common. They don't interpret that, and they never accept the other side's interpretation or logic.
Well,
that's dangerous.
The Americans and the Soviets didn't share a language and played plenty of word games and avoided the very worst.
The difference is they actually had the hard stuff they can negotiate on, the nuclear weapons on. That they did not play charade. That's why they have arms control.
Well, that took a while. It took 15 years before
but
they
it worked.
Started talking.
But it worked. It worked. There's nothing works.
Maybe we can muddle through the next 10 years and then we get to Sino-American detente.
I really doubt, yeah. Hoping.
Well, let's hope.
Thanks for listening to the Monterey Trialogue podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the show so you don't miss out on any episodes. I'm Peter Sleskeen. The Monterey Trialogue podcast is hosted by the Middlebury Institute of International Studies and produced by University FM.